Blazor WebAssembly, also known as Blazor Client, has finally been released. So let's look at what it is, how it works, and how it's different from Blazor Server. Now, in case you haven't watched any of my videos before, my name is Tim Corey, and it's my goal to make learning C# easier. My goal isn't to entertain you. My goal is to turn you into a world-class developer. I do that by making sure that everything I teach focuses on preparing you for the real world. Not only do I create videos like this one, where I teach you about a specific programming topic, I also answer your questions every Thursday in the Dev Question series. I would encourage you to check it out. Plus, if you have a programming question or want to see a specific topic covered, leave a comment on any video and I'll add that to the suggestion list. My content is driven by what you want. Okay, let's go over to Visual Studio. Now today we're going to create a Blazor web application, a Blazor WebAssembly application. So let's create a new project and come down here to Blazor Web App. Now, in order to have the Blazor app available, you have to have a later version of Visual Studio. Now, when I hit next here, I have to name this. So let's give it a quick name here. Let's call this Blazor Web. Let's call it Blazor WebAssembly. And we'll call this Blazor WebAssembly app. All right. And now I have two options, Blazor Server app and Blazor WebAssembly app. Now, if you don't have two options, if you only have one Blazor Server app, then you probably haven't updated to the latest version of Visual Studio 2019. Now, just to be clear here, this isn't for 2017, this isn't for 2015, this isn't for 2013. This is only for Blazor or for Visual Studio 2019. The good news is that Visual Studio 2019 Community Edition is free for just about everyone. So go get it. All right. Now, right now I'm using a template version 3.1.6. And this comes with officially .NET Core 3.2. So this is a latest and greatest. It came out in May of 2020. Now it's early June of 2020, actually mid-June. So we're going to cover what Blazor WebAssembly is and how it's different from Blazor Server. So up here, I'm not going to choose authentication today. I am going to choose HTTPS. I can't choose Docker support. I am not going to do ASP.NET Core hosted, and I'm not going to do a progressive web application. Okay, now here's why. I'm first of all going to cover the progressive web application in a future video. It's coming very soon. But I wanted to separate this out from the progressive web application part of it, because I want to look at what just Blazor WebAssembly is. Now, I'm not choosing the ASP.NET Core hosted version because this essentially makes Blazor WebAssembly into almost entirely a Blazor Server app. It's almost like it kind of backtracks and kind of cuts out some of the goodness of Blazor WebAssembly, in my opinion. So what I do instead is I create just a Blazor WebAssembly app. The Blazor Core or the ASP.NET Core hosted version will create essentially what's kind of like an API for the Blazor WebAssembly to talk to. Well, I like to create my APIs separately, so they're two fully separate projects, not really integrated together. Okay, so we're going to leave those unchecked, just HTTPS. All right, so no authentication, no progressive web application, no ASP.NET Core hosted. So the very first thing I want to do is I just want to start this up. So we'll run IS Express. This is the difference between IS Express and the version that's going to say Blazor WebAssembly, I think we called it, that's Kestrel. I prefer Kestrel, but for this example, I'm going to use IS Express, and I'll show you why. But first, let's look at this app. So it looks an awful lot like a Blazor Server app, default app, if you're used to that. Okay, so we have our home here. There's a survey thing here. That's actually for taking a survey from Microsoft to tell you tell them what you thought of this. I do want to take a quick note here to say that Microsoft actually takes this into account. Okay, so if you're going to give feedback, they're actually going to read it. Okay, in this case, there's nothing to read. It's just for graphs, but your vote will count. Okay, I do want to point that out. Also note that when you give feedback, let's move this out of the way here. When you give feedback in the upper right-hand corner, send feedback, report a problem, or suggest a feature, Microsoft employees actually read that. It's not a black hole. I know sometimes it feels like that, and sometimes your suggestion isn't listened to, and it feels like maybe they just don't care. They do care. It's just that maybe your suggestion didn't fit with their overall plan. Or maybe your problem isn't a widespread problem. It's more your machine. So just know that yes, the team does care. Yes, they do read it. And yes, they do evaluate it. So whenever you see a feedback option, take advantage of it. Communicate what your thoughts are if you have thoughts, okay? And I would encourage you, don't just use it for bad stuff, okay? That's it's really discouraging. That's the stuff that a lot of people do is when it's good, they just kind of leave it alone. They're like, oh, whatever. But when it's bad, they're like, oh, this is horrible. And they actually tell a developer. Well, that's pretty discouraging if all you ever hear is how horrible your product is. So give them a chance. Be kind. Do a survey. If you like it, then, tell them. Very easy. Very high quality. Give them actual feedback. Hopefully positive. Anywho, all right, back to this. So it's a hello world. We got our counter. We can click here. It increments the number. I know it's a little small here. Let's zoom in. So you can click the number and it changes. We can fetch data. That did a data fetch. Woohoo. Now notice here that we have a temperature of 1 and 33. And it's always 1 and 33. It's a little different than the Blazor Server app, which did random data every time. But besides that, it's pretty much the same thing. Okay. In fact, we're going to load up the Blazor Server in a little while and compare the two. In fact, you know what? Now's a great time to do that. So let's really quickly here, right-click on our solution. We're going to add a new project. Come down here to Blazor app. And I'm going to call this Blazor Server. So now I have Blazor WebAssembly and Blazor Server apps. This, of course, will be Blazor Server, HTTPS, but nothing else. Hit create, and now we'll have both web versions. What I'm going to do is right-click on my solution, and I'm going to say Set Startup Projects, and I'm going to choose multiple projects, and I'm going to say Start for both of them. Now when I hit Start, it's going to start both projects at once, so you can have them side by side. Or we can try that, but I'm getting this error right here that says, hey, you can't do that. You can't start it because it's being used by another process. Bummer. Let's try it again. I'm going to stop this. I'm also going to go down here to, you can't see it, but in my my system tray, I have IS Express. I'm going to stop all the processes, and let's start this up again. And nope, it's yelling at me again. So it's not going to start both of them at once. That's okay. We can look at this and do our comparison. So we have, this is our Blazor Server. Notice up in the upper left-hand corner it says Blazor Server. And let's zoom in here a little bit. We can see our survey. We can see our counter, which we click and it changed the number. Our fetch data. Notice it says 25 and 76. Now it says -20 and -3. Now it says 0 and 32. So that changes the data every time. So that's a little different. We'll see why. But otherwise, these pages act the same from our user perspective. Okay? I just want to kind of point that out. So let's undo this start both. Whoops. There we go. Right click and set as startup project. Was down near the bottom. So now I have just the Blazor WebAssembly starting. And that should start again. It does. Okay. So it's just a problem with IS Express not wanting to start both at the same time. I had not checked their port numbers to make sure they were different. Okay. So with that being said, now we have our Blazor WebAssembly and our Blazor Server so you can kind of compare the two and see what the similarities and the differences are. Let's start by just looking at what Blazor WebAssembly has, and then we'll look and see what's different. So Blazor WebAssembly has program.cs, where we start off with a WebAssembly host builder, create defaults, the root component add app. And then we have services add transient, and here's a new HTTP client. Now, if you haven't worked with HTTP client before, this is how we talk to other web applications across the network, especially APIs. So I do have a video on this, I believe it's intro to HTTP client. If you do my channel search, not the YouTube search, but on my channel I have my own search. If you search in there for HTTP client, you'll find the first video that comes up is the video on how this works. So this is our HTTP client, and it's being set up with a base address of this same host environment's base address. Okay, so it's the same localhost version. Okay, so that's adding that, and then we're doing a run async. This is a little different than Blazor Server. We'll see that in a little bit, but this is where all the setup work gets done for our application, including add app, which that's app.razor right here. This is our router. This is where we do things like saying, okay, if you found the route, then go to the route, put the data in here, and the default layout page, if you don't specify one, is main layout. Well, that's right here, main layout. So if you don't specify a layout page, which by default our pages don't, then we're going to use this layout page, which this layout page is a little different because it has a sidebar and the main section, and there's our app body, which is where all the specific views or specific components, HTML and CSS goes. But then we inherit from layout component base, which that's actually a Microsoft component. If we go there, you'll see that there's how to render the body and all the rest. So where's the rest of the stuff? Where's the HTML and the header tag and the body tag? Well, if we go over to www.root, we'll see the index.html, a straight up HTML document that has our HTML, our header, and then our body. And then in here is where we're going to load our app. Okay, right in here. So it starts with says loading, and it'll actually put our app in this section. We also have an error message that can show up, and this is a little bit of JavaScript. It's actually a lot of JavaScript, but this is the JavaScript that translates how to talk to our C# code. So let's take a step back here from it now, and let's talk about what WebAssembly really is. I think this is a good point to do so. So Blazor Server, let's start there, because hopefully you've watched that intro already. I've got an intro video on that. But Blazor Server is an application that runs on the server. All your C# code runs on the server. It gets compiled on the server, and the client just gets HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. There is no C# code that goes to the client. However, there is a little bit of JavaScript that opens up, that connects to the SignalR service, which sends down, which sends back changes saying, hey, they pushed the button. So then the change comes down and says, okay, put the new number of 1 instead of 0 in this spot. And that's how Blazor Server works. Blazor WebAssembly is different. Blazor WebAssembly loads and runs fully on the client. That means that your C# code runs on the client's machine. That may sound a little scary, because what happens is it actually compiles a DLL, sends it down to the client, and says, here's your web application to run. This is how client-side web development works. Okay, so this is no different than if you have an Angular application or a React application or a Vue application, where it's the same thing. All of your code for your application goes down to the client. In fact, let's do this. I'm going to pull up the website getbootstrap.com. Okay, this is the Bootstrap website, which we use Bootstrap in Blazor WebAssembly, in ASP.NET Core, and so on. So let's hit F12 to pull up the developer tools. On this page, if you notice, let's go and let's open up the docs./4.5. Let's go to JS/source, and notice here, toast. Here is all the JavaScript for the toast.js file. Okay, so this is all the code you would need to run the toast JavaScript. So we're used to this, okay? This is what happens on the web with client-side web development. All your code goes to the client side. I know that freaks some people out because they look at that and say, then all of my code can be stolen. And if you do this, then yeah, it kind of could be. Like this is just easy copy and paste stuff. Typically though, with your front-end web application, you wouldn't have all of your code on the client side. Typically you call an API in order to get data. And the API has your business logic and all the rest. So the client-side code really is just about display. That's the same thing we're going to do with our Blazor WebAssembly projects. This whole project should be about displaying data and getting data from the user. That's really its job. It's not about business logic. It's not about data access. In fact, you can't directly access data from a Blazor WebAssembly project. You can't say, give me, let's do a SQL call. Let's use Dapper and we'll talk to SQL. No, you can't do that. You really have to talk to an API or something similar in order to get data in a Blazor WebAssembly application. And the reason for that is because you wouldn't want to send to the client a connection string. I mean, that'd be scary. Here's a connection string to my database. I don't want to give that to my users. Therefore, I can't put it in my Blazor WebAssembly application. Besides the fact that I'm not going to give access directly to the entire, internet for my database. That's just not going to happen. I want to put an API in between. So Blazor WebAssembly really requires that. You can't talk directly to SQL. You can't talk directly to most databases. There are a couple exceptions where it's the same type of database a JavaScript application could write to directly, like a local DB or a local, an index DB, or local storage or session storage, things like that you can write to. But those are all client side, and they're really more volatile. They're not for long-term storage. They're more for short-term storage and caching purposes. Okay, so we've seen how program.cs starts. It calls app. App says, hey, if you have a route, use the main layout by default. If not, use the main layout in general, not even by default for all times, and say, sorry, there's nothing at this address. The main layout is just the sidebar and the main section, but this all goes inside of our index.html. So let's look at this again. Let's run it again. So we're going to say run. It's going to load up. And once it loads up, what we're going to do is we're going to look at how it actually looks behind the scenes. I'm going to hit F12. There's my my developer tools. Let's go to source. And let's look at under framework. You'll see Blazor WebAssembly.js. Let's bring us over here and kind of zoom in. This is a minified file. Let's go to pretty print. Hey, you know what? We minify the file, but pretty print can kind of put it back into a nice readable format. And I say nice and readable, but it's not really readable because you got function E, T, R, and what's happened is this has been minified. So they replaced the nice, neat, easy to read wording with single letter variables because there's less space when you download the file. It also makes it harder to then read and modify by somebody else. So minification does help a little bit with code stealing. All right. Not, again, your code should just be client side, so it shouldn't really matter. But there you go. And then inside WASM, we've got the .NET WASM, and that's still loading. And inside here is where we'll have how our application will actually run. We also have the JavaScript file, which is kind of the WebAssembly wrapper. All right. Then we have a little bit of CSS. There we go. Stopped it. So there's our module. This is all of our really cool code. I'm sure you're fascinated by all this code. It's a lot of interesting code. All right. So this is all the setup for using WebAssembly for .NET. So what WebAssembly is, in case you're not familiar, WebAssembly is a web standard. It's not a Microsoft thing. And this is why Blazor WebAssembly is different than, let's say, Silverlight. Silverlight used a plugin, and then that was proprietary to Microsoft, and then using that plugin, it could then render Silverlight pages. This is different. WebAssembly is a W3C consortium approved standard that all major browsers support, that anybody can use to create WebAssembly projects, to run other code in the web. In our case, it's .NET code. It doesn't have to be, but there's a wrapper, there's .NET 3.2.js. This allows us to basically put into the web our .NET code. All right, so this is built upon web standards. It's not a plugin. It's not something that has to be added to your browser. This is web standard stuff. That's why I am much more positive about this, much more encouraged by this, happy by this, and much more willing to use it in production because it is a web standard that's built upon. Okay, so this is our application. Now here's the actual index page. So this is kind of the deconstructed page. If you go to the elements here, you'll actually see the page. So see this app section right here. Notice that on the sources page, app just says loading. That's the raw page. But then here we see the app has a whole bunch of comment sections, and it has sidebar and more comment sections. These are actually important, by the way. But then it has the actual code kind of intermixed here. There's main and there's more code. It's kind of intermixed with these comment sections. This is what gets rendered using WebAssembly. We have our user interface. We have our link to that JavaScript file and to the other JavaScript file. So there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes to help set this up. But the eventual reality is we're bringing C# code down and running it in the browser. So let's close this out for a minute. Let's close out this browser window as well. And let's talk through a little bit more about what's going on here. Let's look at the rest of this stuff. So we saw that app.razor said, okay, if you don't have a layout, the default layout is main layout. Well, main layout said there's a sidebar, and there's this thing called nav menu. Well, nav menu is actually a Razor component. We saw this in Blazor Server. And there's your navigation. So here is your setup. Here's the actual navigation links and the toggles. So if you click it, it toggles the hamburger menu in and out if it's collapsed. So there is your navigation link. So you can actually add to this by just copying this whole section and then changing the href. So instead of fetch data, it goes somewhere else. Now I'm kind of hitting the high spots here because I don't want to do the same video as my intro to Blazor Server, and I would encourage you to watch that video. Even if you want just WebAssembly, watch the Blazor Server video as well, because these two are really closely tied together. So let's look at the pages. So counter page is going to look exactly the same as the Blazor Server version, but fetch data is a little different. Fetch data, if we come down here to the code, we have http.getFromJSON async, and that's going to load a JSON file. So this is actually loading a file from the web. Now, from the web is kind of a relative term because it's loading it from the sample data folder and it's weather.json. So this is a relative path based upon the root path of our running application. How I know that? Well, because it's using HTTP, which if you look up here is being injected, and it's the HTTP client. Remember back in the beginning in program.cs, we created an HTTP client, and we said that we want to set up the base address to be the base address of the host environment, meaning localhost : I think it's like 44233 or something like that. That's what we're looking at for our base address. So over here in fetch data, we're saying, okay, call the web, and we're going to look at the same URL we're on and go to /sampledata/weather.json. Well, in www root sample data weather.json, there's a JSON file with our data. Notice temperature C is 1. There isn't a temperature F because that gets converted. So that is the number we were seeing. We saw 1, I think it was 33 or something like that. That is the numbers we're seeing consistently. Because unlike the Blazor server, we're not generating that with C#, we're just loading a JSON file. What this is simulating, though, is calling an API and getting data back. So really what you could do is change where the base address is, or even take it off, but you could change the base address and then in here call an API and say, give me the temperature data. And it would go to that API, it would load back the JSON, and they could put that into forecasts and display it like so. So it's kind of simulating an API, but it's not making an API call. So that's different, all right? In fact, let's open up our Blazor server and kind of look at some of these differences. Let's kind of collapse down to the basics and start with the program.cs. So let's close out everything else. This is the Blazor server, and I'm going to open up the Blazor WebAssembly, and let's compare the two side by side. All right. So if we unpin this, it's a little bit off a screen, but that's okay. So in the left-hand side, we have Blazor server. Notice up here, Blazor WebAssembly on the right. So the Blazor server says create host builder, build and run, and the host builder is create default builder, and then configure defaults and use startup of startup. Whereas in the main over here on WebAssembly, we're doing all the startup stuff right in main. We don't have a startup.cs. If you go over here to our Blazor WebAssembly, there's no startup.cs in this project. So over here on the left in Blazor server, we're defaulting to a startup.cs, which has, let's move it over to the correct side. It has things like our configure services where we add our singletons. There's the weather service, where we do other configuration like developer execution page and HSTS and HTTPS redirection and routing and endpoints and all that stuff we do in startup.cs. We don't do any of that in Blazor WebAssembly. All of that is compacted down to 3 lines of code, which is WebAssembly host builder, create default, the root components, add app, and here's the one service to add. So there's not a lot going on in the program.cs, but those 3 lines replace startup.cs in the Blazor server side. And then we have the builder, build, and run async. Just like this build and run, well, it's not run async, but builder run, well, that's builder run async. There we go. It's running our application. So that's the first major difference. Now let's pin this again, and let's look at what else we have that's a little different. Notice in Blazor Server we have app-settings.json with no app-settings.json in Blazor WebAssembly. One of the reasons for that is because everything goes down to the client. So it's kind of not the same thing as a server. Now, technically, you can create a app-settings.json file in Blazor WebAssembly, but it's going to download to the user's machine, which means, in theory, if they knew how to, they could open up that settings file and read the settings information. Not ideal if you're trying to store some kind of secret in there. But again, that's just like a JavaScript application. You have to think through how you do your secrets if you have any secrets that go to the client. Usually you don't. So we don't have an app-settings.json in our Blazor WebAssembly file. We also, we have imports, app.razor, and program. We have imports, app.razor, program. We're missing those two you already mentioned, app-settings.json, startup.json. The app.razor looks pretty much the same. Okay, those two. Let's do the horizontal this time instead. So up top we have the WebAssembly version, and bottom we have the WebAssembly's in the bottom, and up top is Blazor Server. Okay, so this is Blazor Server up top, but you really can't tell a difference. I mean, they're pretty much, in fact, I think they're identical. So that's the same. So they have an app.razor. They act the same. The import statements are pretty much the same. So the difference here is that, and layout, which actually layout's the same, sorry. Layout's the same. Even the inherits from layout component base is the same. There is a link different here. Notice that it's blazor.net versus docs.microsoft.com/ASP.NET. I'm wondering if that's a typo. Not sure there. It probably should go to the new blazor.net. They probably just didn't update that when they updated Blazor WebAssembly. So they probably didn't update Blazor Server. So the stuff we have here is pretty much the same stuff. It's just that there's a few tweaks. So our pages, we go to fetch data. Down here, there is a get forecast async, which is going to this data folder. This is the server side, Blazor Server. But here we don't have that data folder. We don't have the fetch data that calls to a C# method, because we don't really call C# methods in Blazor WebAssembly in order to get data. Instead, we call APIs using our HTTP client in order to get that data. So Blazor WebAssembly is really reliant on third-party or external data given to it, and then sending its data to a third party. Now, a third party may be you. It may be your API, and probably it is, but it is reliant on that external application to give it data. Now, the next difference is in pages. So in our, let's collapse these down so we have a little more space here. You can see a little bit more clearly. In our Blazor server, notice we have 5 pages. We have _host, we have counter, error, fetch data, and index. Down below, in our Blazor WebAssembly, we have counter, fetch data, and index. So that's it. We don't have these other pages. So let's look at these other pages and see what they are. Well, the error page is kind of self-explanatory. That's where you go whenever you have an error. The host page, this is our actual starting page, or our layout. I don't want to say layout because that's not a layout page. It's the HTML page that we render to the client. Okay, so we have things like our doc type and HTML and head and body and so on. Well, all of that stuff isn't in Blazor WebAssembly. There is no _host file, but instead there's that index.html. That's where ours in WebAssembly is set up. So that's a difference. Because remember, WebAssembly runs in the client machine, and so the client machine doesn't have .NET Core installed. It doesn't have any version of .NET installed. We have to bring it with us, and so we can't start with a .NET Core style starting page. We've got to start with what the web knows. The web knows index.html. So that's where we start on Blazor WebAssembly version, is index.html. This script right here with the blazor.webassembly.js, that's what then kicks off and says, okay, we're going to bring down some the mono version of .NET Core or of .NET, and we're going to then load our DLL from our actual application. Here's how we render it and all the rest. So this page has to be a standard page that a web server would be able to handle. Therefore, index.html. That's why it's different than up here. And that's about all there is for the differences between these two different types. The rest of the stuff, if you learned Blazor Server, then you pretty much know about 95% of Blazor WebAssembly. If you've learned Blazor WebAssembly, you know about 95% of Blazor Server. So the two really work well together. So let's talk about why would you use one over the other? Well, Blazor Server runs on the server. That's kind of in the name. It operates similar to what ASP.NET Core MVC does, or Razor Pages does, or things like that, where it's a server-side language, which means that it gets compiled on the server, and then when a user requests a page, what they get is an HTML page. They don't get any C# code. Even though, if we go look in Blazor Server page, let's look at fetch data. Fetch data right here, we have this @if, this else, we have a for each, we have some code here. The user sees none of this. The user has no way to access any of this because this all gets run on the server. And then once the rendering is done on the server, then it sends the page down to the client. Now, Blazor Server is a little bit different in the fact that this all gets rendered on the server, that the user never sees anything else. But let's just say that the forecast is null to begin with, which it will be. Then the page is going to have this. But as soon as the forecast has data, it's going to evaluate this if and change the value of what's in this section to be this data, including this rendered for each. So what's going to happen on the client side is it's going to say, or the server side is going to say, hey, I've got new data for that section. It's going to send the data down. The client side says, oh, okay, I'll put this new rendered data into that section. And it just gets HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to put in that section. So Blazor Server runs on the server, and all the C# code is hidden and is never accessible to the end user, which is why we can have app settings.json with connection strings that could be secure, like they could have secure information or sensitive data, and that's okay. Now, Blazor WebAssembly is different. Blazor WebAssembly, like I said, it compiles the DLL, but then it sends it down to the user and says, render this. And so on the client side, you will see, or you can see, the C# code. So you can see this code if you dig into it. You can get to it and you can see how it's all designed and laid out. So the benefit of a server was we could actually access sensitive data like a database directly. That's a drawback for the client. The client cannot access a database directly. There are some things it can't do because it's on the client side. It's just not safe to do on the client side. It needs to talk to an intermediary like an API in order to get that sensitive data. However, when you load all of this stuff onto the client, if the client says, I want to re-render this page 18 times, The client's machine is the one doing the rendering. Now, it may not seem like a big deal versus the rendering the server, because servers render a lot of things really fast. However, it's a scale issue. If you give a WebAssembly to 1 million computers, let's just say 1 million people come to your website, which, by the way, is not going to happen, almost assuredly. Usually websites don't get hit anywhere near hard enough to make a difference. But I'm just pointing this out for reference purposes. If 1 million people went to your website all at once and downloaded the Blazor WebAssembly version, that would be a bottleneck because downloading the entire DLL will take some time. And by time, not a lot, okay? They've shrunk this DLL down significantly. And it's just your code that's really going to bloat that up again. But there is a little bit of download time. However, once it gets down, then the pages can be rendered on the client's machine, meaning there will be no speed penalty for having 1 million people loading your site versus 1. This is the same benefit and drawback that all of the JavaScript frameworks have. So Angular, React, Vue, these applications have an upfront download, and it can be a significant download of JavaScript and CSS and HTML. But once that gets downloaded, then you don't have a performance penalty if you have 1 million people rendering your site at once or just 1. It's the same performance because it's all running on the client's machine. You're essentially outsourcing your work. Blazor Server, on the other hand, every time you add another client, you open up another SignalR connection, which takes, I think it's like 200 kilobytes to 300 kilobytes of memory per connection. So if you have 1 million people connecting to your server, which wouldn't work, but if you did, then you would be taking up a lot more resources, and rendering those pages would be detrimental to the server. There'd be so many, they would overload the server. I've heard that a decently sized web server on Azure can do about 20,000 sessions at a time. My guess is that about 99% of the people listening to this aren't going to use more than that. Okay? So, and if you did, you could scale to 2 and 3 servers. But what I'm saying is Blazor WebAssembly offloads that work, and you could scale to a higher number in theory because you're offloading your work. So there's a benefit of Blazor WebAssembly. Also, and we're going to cover this more in a future video, Blazor WebAssembly is the only one of the two, is the one out of the two that can do a progressive web application, meaning it can download to your desktop like an application, or it can download to your phone like an app, and it can be treated like a regular app on your phone or desktop, including having an offline mode. So if you need offline access, you have to use Blazor WebAssembly. You can't use Blazor Server. Blazor Server requires that server. Now again, we're going to cover some caveats there because it's not all sunshine and roses with progressive web applications. There are some significant drawbacks. It's not the killer application that it might be touted as, but it is really good. Okay? So I think that where I land on all of this, and I've covered this more in my Which ASP.NET Core course, where we talk about the 5 different types and when to use each. But in general, if I'm looking at these two, I lean towards choosing Blazor Server for my web projects. And the reason why is because it's simpler. I can talk to a SQL Server directly. I can have my DLL that has my Dapper calls that talk directly to a SQL Server. I can talk to Cosmos DB, whatever I want to do in my DLLs that then connect to my Blazor Server directly. That makes my life easier. With Blazor WebAssembly, I have to write an API. It's an extra layer. Now, with that being said, if you're going to write an application of any size I would encourage you anyway to write an API. If you've been following my Timco Retail Manager course, and if not, there's a playlist called Timco Retail Manager. Check it out. In there, we created an API. And the reason why is because we started off with a WPF user interface for our cash register and administration of our application. But we're going to add other things to that. And here's a little hint. We're going to add a Blazor WebAssembly project that talks to our API. So that API now allows me to connect multiple user interfaces to it, not just one. So there's definitely a benefit to an API. It's just that it's an added step, or it's an added kind of headache in some ways. So there is some benefits and drawbacks here. What I do want to make sure I communicate clearly is that there isn't one right answer. And I often get asked this, which one is best? And the answer is always going to be, it depends. There's a reason why we don't have just one programming language. There's a reason why we don't have just one desktop application type or web application type, because different ones have different purposes and different strengths and weaknesses. So Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly each have their strengths in certain circumstances. And it's not as simple as, well, I'm going to do a marketing application. I'm going to do a banking application. That's not enough information. If you've watched my Which ASP.NET Core course, you'll know there's a lot more that goes into it because there's a lot more options and things to think through, including what is the makeup of my team? What are we looking to do long term with this project? What's my environment like? What's management looking for in the future? There's a lot of stuff that goes into making a decision. But I will tell you that both of these product types are really good. They really have a lot of benefits. If I had to choose one blindfolded without knowing what your project is, I would choose Blazor Server because it's the easiest, most well-rounded application. But if you want offline support, if you want the client side fully, then Blazor WebAssembly is definitely the way to go. So that's my little 2-minute comparison of the two. I do want to focus on WebAssembly for this video, but that's really a good intro, I think, to what all this can do. It's a simple application. I'm not saying it's easy, because there's an awful lot to learn here, especially if you're new to web development. Now, if you are new to web development, this may not be the place to start. I would start with Razor Pages. I've got a video on that, an intro to ASP.NET Core Razor Pages you can check out. That's probably an easier starting point. And really before then, learn C#. This is one of the things that people often ask me. I'm new to C#. What about Blazor? Well, that's the end, not the beginning. The beginning of any C# application is learning C# well. Okay? Sorry, a little bit of a side trail there. So with Blazor WebAssembly, it is a good web product. It is ready for production today. It is new though, and that is something to always be careful of. With a new product, there's going to be bugs, there's going to be things not fully implemented yet, there's things they're still working on. Now, the team has done a great job. They've had preview releases out where they got feedback. They have been very open. Remember that Blazor WebAssembly is open source, just like Blazor Server, just like ASP.NET Core in general. So you can even go to GitHub and look at their issues, look at the issue list, and see what's going on, and even contribute your own issues. Don't forget, you can also use this little send feedback button to do the same thing. But with all of that, it is production ready, and it is something you could start using in your production apps. I would encourage you to check it out. I would encourage you to play with it. And as always, when you learn something new, don't just put it into a production application. Do what I've done here. Create a new project, test it out, try some things, figure some things out, and kind of play with it and poke it a little bit, okay? So that's it for this video. I think the next video will probably cover more about Blazor WebAssembly, especially progressive web applications, and how they work and what would happen if we use that feature, what it looks like, okay? Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, leave them down below, and I will get back to you, and I will put them on a list for future videos, okay? Thanks for watching, and as always, I am Tim Corey.